Canadian destroyers Skeena and Vancouver had just received an urgent message from the President of the United States. They were ordered to scramble to the coast of El Salvador as soon as possible. This was an emergency, as within the country, all hell broke loose. No one knew who controlled the government, or even if there was one. People were being massacred left and right in the streets in the thousands, what would be the start of a genocide. And all of the chaos was caused by one thing: coffee. Yeah, the same coffee that you and I drink on a daily basis. And now you're probably wondering, how could that be the case? Well, it's a long story. A story which tells the history of man through the lens of a single being that changed the world. Coffee is a drink which revolutionized humanity's relationship to work, politics, and socialization. However, it's also been the catalyst of genocides, a sustenance for slavery, and a fuel for military war machines. Coffee connected the globe in a way that we had never seen before. But through the dependencies it created, it simultaneously divided the world into the rich and powerful countries that consume coffee and the poor and helpless ones that produce it. This is the story of coffee.
I was tempted by your smile. I was tempted, and for a little while I was certain.
In order to understand how he would end up here, I need to take you to the very beginning, in the year of 1500 AD. Native to Ethiopia, where the first harvest gathered beans from wild coffee plants, it quickly caught fire around the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, a coffee house was often the first thing Ottoman emperors built upon conquering a new city in order to display the, quote, civility of their rule. The word coffee itself derives from the Arabic word for wine, meaning that coffee was the wine of Islam. But due to its intoxicating effects, it was the subject of great suspicion from state authorities. In 1511, the police of Mecca torched all of the coffee in the city, and within the next decades, a movement broke out based around Muslim people's right to drink coffee. Now, by this point, European traders had discovered the controversial beverage. Amazed by its taste and properties, they brought it back to their homeland. It received quite some resistance as it was stigmatized as an Arabic drink that was a symbol of Islam. However, they couldn't deny its power to alter people's moods, even though they had no clue how it did so. Nonetheless, the drink started to catch on. In the 1650s, the first coffee house opened up in London, and within years it would be the first of many that would sprout up across the city. Quickly, they caught on among the intelligentsia of the country, serving as penny universities where forums and discussions on the newest and brightest ideas were held, essentially creating a new social class where status and wealth mattered none, and instead the ideas one brought forth were the only things that determined one's worth. The democratic free speech that was cultured in these coffee houses soon became increasingly political and started to become ever more critical of the royal court. Sensing the threat to his power, Charles II attempted to cut off the snake at its head, banning coffee houses entirely under the guise that they were quote-unquote seedbeds for unrest and spreading fake news. As you could imagine, this did not go over well, and London's political sphere had reached a near mutinous condition. Charles gave in and let coffeehouses operate, but only under the guise that they would be surveilled by the state and not allow any political discourse. Many coffeehouses did come back, but a solid number rebranded themselves as pubs in order to escape the surveillance of the royal court. Coffee was now an established part of European culture, especially in Britain, in large part because it offered something completely new. Before coffee, people would just drink alcohol, which would make them drowsy and tired, which was an employer's worst nightmare. Coffee did the exact opposite. It actually made people more productive, which was an incredible thing. Tea, which offered similar benefits, became somewhat familiar with the British people. However, it actually entered the country after coffee did. And it didn't really catch on until the 18th century because tea was simply more expensive than coffee since the trade was controlled by the Dutch. However, soon Britain gained access to Chinese ports and cheap tea flooded the country and dethroned coffee as a result. But the Dutch didn't just trade in tea, they were actually the first ones to establish a coffee plantation outside of Arabic control by introducing it to the island of Java and exporting it through the port of Mocha in 1699. Then the French did on the island of Bourbon, and then the British in Jamaica, and by 1748 the Spaniards planted it in Cuba. And then over the next half century, coffee spread pretty much anywhere in the Americas that offered enough sun, rain, and most importantly slave labor to turn a profit. During the transatlantic slave trade, North America received 388,000 slaves from Africa. Brazil, on the other hand, welcomed over 5.8 million. In 1790, the state of Rio only produced a single ton of coffee, and it was strictly for local consumption. However, within just 50 years, it would go on to produce half of the coffee in the world. And that's because in that time frame, they would receive 2.5 million slaves from Africa, the most dense period of shipment to any country in the world during the transatlantic slave trade by far. 3,000 miles of forest went up in flames in order to make way for more coffee fields. Business was booming, and this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, the United States was increasingly adopting coffee consumption as a norm of life to a degree unseen anywhere else in the world. From the inception of the American Revolution, coffee became the drink of America. In the face of British tea taxes and the subsequent Boston Tea Party, coffee drinking became synonymous with rebelling against British authority. Just to show how far this went, in 1799, coffee consumption per year reached around 1.4 pounds per person, which was 7 times higher than before the start of the Revolutionary War. Despite this, coffee was still too expensive and inaccessible for everyday people to be deemed an American custom. Even during the Revolutionary War, coffee wasn't included in the rations of soldiers in George Washington's Continental Army. But after gaining independence, the young country started to toothe with imperial aspirations. Unable to compete with the European powerhouses on their own playing field in Africa or Asia, they instead looked to capitalize on their immediate surroundings. As the only powerful independent nation in the entirety of the New World, extending their influence into the countries to their south was something they could do with little, if not any, resistance from their friends in Europe. The result was that US imports of coffee doubled each and every decade between 1800 and 1850, and following the laws of supply and demand, there was so much coffee entering the country that it was no longer a drink for elites. Coffee was now a drink for soldiers, pioneers, miners, factory workers, or pretty much anyone in the line of work that valued staying alert. In the American Civil War, the average Union soldier consumed 36 pounds of coffee beans per year, enough to amount to around 5 cups of joe each and every day. This means that coffee enhanced their combat effectiveness and, in a way, aided the emancipation of American slavery. But the United States was generally late to the party in comparison to their European counterparts, or even their colonies in the Americas. But one country in particular was especially late to banning slavery, and that was Brazil. While millions of slaves embraced freedom for the first time in the United States, the ones in Brazil were still hard at work, harvesting sugar, mining precious materials, and last but not least, picking coffee beans. But in 1888, the Golden Law was enacted, and slavery, the thing that propped up the entire Brazilian economy, was now suddenly illegal. While Brazil scrambled to rearrange its economy to fit a slave-free system, the other countries around them now had an opportunity. You see, since Brazil was late to emancipation, for decades the other local coffee-producing countries had to try to compete with them, all while paying their workers while Brazil never needed to, which gave them an unfair advantage. But now Brazil needs to figure out how to play the game its neighbors had been playing all along. The playing field was finally even, and meanwhile, demand was growing in the United States. In 1870, the population of the US was 38 million people, and within the next 3 decades, 12 million more would arrive. Many of these immigrants coming from places with very strong coffee drinking cultures. The result was thousands of new coffee houses springing up in cities across America. Jacob Riis, a photographer famous for exposing the horrific conditions these immigrants lived in, was himself amazed at how even the poorest Americans could get their hands on coffee. Just to illustrate this change, immediately following the Civil War, per capita Americans drank 5 pounds of coffee per year, around enough for 2 cups of coffee for every 3 days. By the turn of the century in 1900, Americans were drinking almost twice as much, just over 1.5 cups per day. With Latin America now being the undisputed global producer of coffee, the tail end of the 19th century solidified the United States as the biggest coffee drinking powerhouse in the world. With Americans now drinking 10 pounds of coffee per year, they drank double that of the Germans and the French, quintuple that of people living in Austria, and 10 times more than Italians, and the British didn't even come close either. Meanwhile, the way coffee was being served was changing too. Mocha and Java coffee, which used to denote where it actually came from, became a brand name used to make the beans coming from Latin America sound exotic, and to also help distance them from the uncomfortable history of forced labor in the region. And the Hills brothers started to market that they had the best Java and Mocha coffee available on the market. But the thing was, they were actually creating their very own definition of best by redefining how the quality of coffee was determined. Before this point in history, coffee was graded on the quality of the bean itself, if it was a certain size, color, smell, and if it was in a uniform batch. This was easy to do because it was all visual and can easily be measured, but many found that the system didn't really translate well into predicting how the experience would be in the cup. So instead, the Hills brothers decided to judge coffee on not what could be seen, but rather on what could be tasted. And this standard of quality measuring made sense, and the result was that Hillsboro's coffee quickly spread to retailers all across San Francisco. But in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a member of the Black Hand, and what was thought to be a third Balkan War soon engulfed the entire European continent. With those markets now cut off, coffee prices plummeted to the lowest they had been in a century. And because it was so cheap, coffee was still flooding the United States more than ever, but it was increasingly becoming more and more controversial. By this point in history, caffeine had already been discovered by a German scientist named Friedrich Ruge almost a century ago. When he first isolated the alkaloid, he came up with its name by using the German word for coffee and adding the Latin "ine" as a suffix, meaning of the nature of. Caffeine quite literally means of the nature of coffee. But past that point, little was known of how it actually functioned, and many people fear that there must be some dangerous downside to this energetic drink. I mean, for all it's worth, it could be killing the entire American population slowly one by one, and no one was a bigger champion of this than John Harvey Kellogg, the serial Goliathan. Kellogg believed that both tea and coffee were, quote, a grave menace to the health of the American people. He considered coffee an addiction that was sucking Americans' vitality right out of them. He even created his own coffee substitute made from grain and molasses and created an ad campaign all about destroying the love for coffee that Americans had garnered. Some of the things in these ads are downright comical, stating that coffee causes disintegration of the brain, blindness, poverty, and paralysis. Back then, people didn't really know if these could be real side effects of coffee. But the storyline does get crazier. In 1909, federal agents stopped a Coca-Cola syrup truck on its way to a factory and charged the company with false marketing under the guise that the drink didn't have Coke or cola in it. 2 years later, this went to court in a case titled, and I'm not kidding, United States v. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. To make its case, the government brought in religious fundamentalists who argued that Coca-Cola led to quote-unquote sexual indiscretions of co-eds and other crazy things I can't really mention in this video. So Coca-Cola felt it necessary to commission a study on the effects of caffeine. In this study, scientists first isolated caffeine and made a concentrate, and then they pumped rabbits through a catheter full of it until they died. From this, they estimated the equivalent lethal dose of caffeine for a person may be around 154 cups of coffee. Naturally, they then tried to pump the rabbits to death with regular coffee, but they wouldn't die before their stomachs became too full to ingest more. So then and there, it was decided coffee could not kill a person, and the American public took this to heart. After World War I, coffee drinking contests spread across the country in the spirit of testing quote-unquote the threshold of the human machine. Each month it seemed like a new record was set, and then the next month another one broken, until one man broke not only the record, but the theoretical 154 cup threshold for how much coffee a person can drink before they die. The record set in 1927, which still stands today, is 157 cups of coffee, set by Albert Baker. Each cup was 8 ounces, and he did it in just 6 hours, meaning he drank almost 10 gallons of coffee in 6 hours. Just 2 years later, the Black Tuesday stock market crash to plunge America into the largest modern economic calamity to date, the Great Depression. And many Americans will now get just a taste of what has been happening to those in Latin America for decades. But before we get into that, I would like to mention my affiliate for this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is a platform where you can pick up new skills and get certified for them online. Over 12 million people use at least one of Skillshare's 30,000 plus classes, and the annual membership may seem pricey, but over 40% of hiring managers say that this kind of certification is just as good as traditional methods, which cost significantly more. So if this sounds like something that may interest you, feel free to click the link at the very top of the description. Now, back to the video. Between 1914 and 1930, US investments in Latin America more than tripled from 1.5 to over $5 billion. US forces had occupied Nicaragua, Haiti, and the economy of the Dominican Republic was under American control due to a loan default, and American corporations turned countless Caribbean nations into indebted banana republics. When coffee prices crashed after the start of the First World War, many plantations could not make enough profit to pay their mortgages and had to default on their loans. The result was a massive consolidation of coffee plantations into the hands of corporations instead of individual landowners, especially in El Salvador, who had emerged as a massive coffee exporter after the Brazilian slavery ban. In 1920, an astonishing 80% of El Salvador's exports was coffee, and since the collapse of the price, it itself was on thin ice when it came to repaying its loans to America. But it had much more deep-seated issues than that, starting from the bottom level, the plantations themselves. El Salvador, while not rich by any means, at one point had lots of different crops that anyone could eat, including a wide variety of delicious fruits such as mangoes, bananas, or yucca. But slowly but surely, coffee plantations erased almost any diversity in its surroundings. Field after field was replaced with coffee until in every direction, no matter how far you walk, coffee is all the eye can see. A once blooming and diverse culture was subjected under the monoculture of a coffee land. When planting a new field of coffee, a tree does not have its first bloom until 7 years have passed. Once that day comes during coffee picking season, it's off to the races. The main incentive for those who were actually picking the coffee wasn't to make a bit of money, it was actually to simply survive. The vast majority of workers' pay was in food, which was much cheaper to the owner than paying with money. In fact, it was half as cheap. Each and every day, every meal was the exact same. 2 thick corn tortillas and whatever amount of black beans could be balanced on each, plus coffee brewed from beans not good enough to be sent abroad. Because of the fact that there wasn't much other food growing on the island anymore, this was the only way most people could get a meal. If they needed extra work to be done, they would offer up extra food ration instead of money. And if a worker didn't work hard enough, they would threaten to withhold their next meal, resulting in locking workers into a vicious cycle where they need to expend immense amount of calories in order to eat and simply replace them with a meal, and so on and so forth. If you had a child back home, some of your ration would be saved in order to feed them. In Coffeeland, many women worked just about as much as men did, especially if they had a child. After all, they need to eat and bring back rations to their families as well. But they worked in more diligent lines of work related to processing and drying. On rare occasions, owners would pit men and women against one another in coffee picking competitions for food. And due to the fact that the portions of the food were so exact and the workers so dependent on them, the plantation owners knew exactly how much work each meal fueled, meaning that just by simply looking at how much the kitchen produced in comparison to how many coffee beans were produced, they could deduce if their workers were slacking and there needs to be something corrected. respected. Even minor violations of the rules resulted in severe punishments. Once a planter with a grove of orange trees found his workers picking oranges instead of coffee, and he shot one of them in the head. Another instance happened where a boy was caught stealing a sack of coffee, and he was hung on the spot. In a flurry of hunger, malnutrition, and abuse, the country of El Salvador was destabilizing. America sent an envoy to get a sense of what was happening on the ground, and he sent a report back to Washington in which he stated, "I imagine that the situation in El Salvador today is very much like France was before its revolution, Russia was before its revolution, and like Mexico was before its revolution." Capitalism had failed these people so horrifically that any other option seemed like it could not possibly be worse. The first ever communist candidate failed on what was likely a rigged ballot, and the one who won the election immediately turned against his promises. He sent out groups of soldiers to quell any dissent with gunfire, killing as many as 60 people in one protest. And what followed was a coup. The Americans scrambled 2 Canadian destroyers to investigate, and to them it seemed that the situation was under control. They were told that the communists had been handled and around 4,800 insurgents had been killed. Soon after, the ships left the country, and what ensued after was, and I quote, "an unequivocal genocide," an event so gruesome that it is known in history books as La Matanza, and for those of you like me who don't speak Spanish, the slaughter. Soldiers drove along the countryside with a hunt for insurgents, but they shot people for other reasons: age, gender, and most importantly, race. The killing became exclusively focused on Indians, as the term Indian and communist became synonymous. By the end of the killing in 1932, around 30,000 people were murdered, approximately 4% of the country's entire population, or just under 1 person for every 20 people. Going forward under this regime, El Salvador was built upon 2 things: genocide and coffee, and within 2 years, the United States officially recognized the regime in order to resume its coffee trade with the country. But in the United States, another coffee-related change was also occurring. With the onset of the Second World War in Europe, and with Americans dragged to the conflict after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the demographics of most workplaces changed, and with this, so did the way Americans drank coffee forever. With working men leaving to fight, employers had a lot less bargaining power when it came to how they treated their employees. They needed to simply fill the roster, either with older men or women. But especially for physical work, they found that their workers ended the day severely fatigued and that it was affecting the quality of their work the next day. The solution? 2 15-minute breaks throughout the workday, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, all with coffee. Once the first few companies realized how much more productivity this actually created, it became a custom in almost every job across the country. And once the war was over and all the men came back to their workplaces, the workers who had been there were reluctant to give up their coffee breaks, and it officially became a staple of the American workplace. But one employer decided that he would make coffee breaks mandatory to maximize productivity, but he would make them unpaid in order to, quote, make sure they are relaxed. This felt unfair to the employees, so they took it to court. They felt that coffee breaks should be paid, and this raised the question, do coffee breaks benefit the employee or the employer more? The court decided that there was at least an equal benefit or more to employers, and that coffee breaks bore a close relationship to work and thus required compensation. Workers across the country now had the right to drink coffee and to get paid to do it. In 1979, El Salvador experienced another coup to overthrow the regime responsible for the genocide in the 1930s, and this coup split the nation, resulting in a civil war. Americans intervened by putting boots on the ground, an effort which amounted to the largest American counterinsurgency campaign between the fall of Saigon and the invasion of the Middle East following 9/11. Over 12 years, 75,000 people died and 1 million people, approximately 1/5 of the country, fled its borders in hopes of finding someplace better. And that brings us to the present. Today, America's reluctance back then to modernize and extend things like the Marshall Plan to various countries in Latin America haunts it, as this aided, or it can be argued to be the root cause, in creating the modern economic catastrophe that led to the crisis of the uncontrollable numbers of immigrants surging on its southern border over the past few years. Today, there are various organizations that work to undo the coffee monocultures created in Latin America by reintroducing a variety of crops back into their lands. And many coffee companies are ethically sourced, but there's a debate over what ethically necessarily means. Remember, El Salvador in the 1920s technically was not practicing slavery. Meanwhile, all across the globe, countries have adopted the Hills Brothers tasting method to determine the quality of the coffee beans. After all, coffee has more tasting notes than wine. And many businesses in other countries also adopted the American coffee break into the daily routine of the workplace. And in the United States today, coffee makes up 5% of the entire consumer market. And now I would like to end this video by posing the ultimate question that this entire story has led to. And that is, in purely economic terms, how much productivity is created from the work that goes into cultivating coffee beans? Or in layman's terms, how many hours of productivity does 1 hour of picking coffee beans in Latin America generate in a country like the United States? Well, the math shows that 1.5 hours of work is required to make a pound of coffee, and that 1 pound of coffee generates around 30 hours of work. So 1 hour of picking coffee in a plantation magically spawns 20 hours of work somewhere else in the world for someone that you'll never meet. In a way, that's nothing short of remarkable, and I'll leave it to you to decide in the comments, was it worth it? Now, coffee is such an expansive subject that it's hard to create a cohesive story, so if I happen to miss one of your favorite coffee facts, or you may have gotten confused at points in this video, you have my deepest apologies. But I would love to learn what you know, so drop all those coffee fun facts that I missed into the comment section as well. This is Salt and Pepper Economics, where we cover the incredible stories of the things we all take for granted. And now you know the incredible story of coffee. I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.